There are homes where the silence weighs more than the furniture. Places where a father starts walking carefully, measuring his words, giving in once again to avoid an awkward phone call, a reproach, a scene. And the most unsettling part is that from the outside everything looks normal, even loving, while inside something is slowly breaking apart. At what point did caring for a child stop being an act of love and start costing you your peace? Manipulation by adult children almost never arrives with a cruel face. It usually shows up as need, as fragility, as a wound that always demands an immediate response. That is why so many parents fail to see it. They confuse guilt with duty, exhaustion with love, and end up holding together relationships that consume them while they keep telling themselves they are doing the right thing. But no, not every sacrifice is noble. Sometimes it only trains you to disappear from yourself. In this journey, you will understand why this happens, how to recognize the emotional cruelty hidden behind certain behaviors, and how you can protect your peace without turning into stone. We will do it through a wisdom that has spent more than 2,000 years teaching human beings not to hand their minds over to chaos, stoicism, and by the time we reach the end, it is very likely you will never look at this bond the same way again. I'm Gabriel, and this is the Stoic Garden. Stay with me until the end because today we are going to walk through 7 keys that can give you back a part of yourself. You may have been quietly giving away for far too long, and the last one is the hardest to accept, precisely because it completely changes what many people call love. There are parents who do not live with an adult child in the house, yet still live with that child lodged in their conscience. The child is in the phone, in the guilt, in the urgency of every message, in that feeling that if they do not respond immediately, something terrible will happen. And so, little by little, they stop deciding from a place of calm and start reacting from fear. Not because they are weak, but because they love. And that is exactly why they become vulnerable to a form of control far more dangerous than shouting, the kind that presents itself as pain, as lack, as legitimate need. And that brings us to the first key in this journey: manipulation disguised as love and need. No one easily accepts the idea that their own child could manipulate them. That thought hurts, makes them uncomfortable, shatters a very deep image. Because a parent wants to believe that if their child insists, cries, demands, or dramatizes, it is because they are truly suffering, and sometimes they are. The problem is that real suffering does not make every behavior sacred. A wound does not turn intrusion into something noble. A problem does not give anyone the right to hijack your peace. But many parents, just to avoid feeling cruel, start justifying what in any other context they would instantly recognize as emotional blackmail. The most effective manipulation does not look like manipulation. It looks like fragility. It looks like dependence. It looks like that anxiety-filled phone call where somehow you always end up paying, fixing things, giving in, or giving up something important. It looks like that trembling voice that appears the moment you try to set a boundary. It looks like that sudden, almost theatrical collapse when you say you cannot do it anymore. What a convenient coincidence, isn't it? Right when you want to recover a little order in your life, the other person suddenly discovers they are on the edge of the abyss and that only you can save them. And so love stops being a bond and becomes a trap dressed up as duty. Seneca, who knew human passions very well and understood the way they drag us along when we do not examine them, warned that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. And here that weighs far more than it seems. Because the manipulated parent does not obey only what is happening, but what they fear will happen if they stop holding everything together. They fear being a bad parent. They fear their child will fall apart. They fear a rupture. They fear feeling guilty forever. So they no longer act with clarity. They act to silence that fear. And when fear drives the relationship, manipulation has already found an open door. The hardest part is that this mechanism usually settles in without any scandal. It does not break down the door. It slips in through small concessions repeated over years. Today you lend money again. Tomorrow you change your plans to avoid a conflict. Then you stay quiet about a disrespectful comment because they're not doing well emotionally. Later you accept being spoken to in ways you would never allow from anyone else because, poor thing, they're going through so much. And that is how a twisted dynamic takes shape. One person learns that pressure gets results. and the other learns that love means putting up with everything. Do you see how dangerous that is? It does not only damage the relationship, it also distorts the very meaning of love. Loving an adult child does not mean becoming a hostage to their moods. It does not mean living on call for every crisis, or falling apart every time a need wrapped in drama appears. Healthy love supports, guides, and helps when needed, but it does not kneel before manipulation. When you fail to see this difference, you end up handing over your energy, your time, and even your dignity to a dynamic that feeds on your good faith. And if this is stirring something in you, it is because you have already begun to see what used to be hidden by emotional fog. Guilt rarely enters with noise. It does not need to threaten, insult, or slam a hand on the table. It only needs to suggest that you failed, that you arrived too late, that you were not there, that you did not understand, that you did not give enough. And when an adult child learns how to touch that nerve, they discover direct access to the emotional center of their parents. They no longer have to ask clearly or take responsibility for what belongs to them. It is enough to trigger that old wound of being an imperfect father or mother, and that brings us to the second point in this journey: guilt as a silent weapon within the relationship. There are phrases that sound innocent, but they come loaded with surgical precision. Don't worry, I'll handle it myself like I always do. It's fine, I don't need anything from you. I guess your own things matter more to you. There is no need to raise your voice when you know how to plant guilt. In fact, sometimes the softer the tone, the deeper the poison goes. Because this is not about discussing a real need, but about planting in the other person the feeling that any boundary is selfishness, any distance is abandonment, and any refusal is an emotional betrayal. What is unsettling is that many parents do not even realize the process. They just feel an inner weight, a discomfort that pushes them to give in. They are about to say no, but something stops them. They were going to stand firm, but they end up calling again, sending money again, apologizing again. And why? Because guilt, when used well, does not argue with you on the surface. It works on you from within. It turns you into judge and defendant at the same time. And when that happens, the manipulator no longer needs to fight. You do the work for them. Epictetus, who had been a slave before becoming a teacher, understood better than most the difference between what happens outside us and the judgment we form inside. That is why he insisted that it is not events themselves that disturb people, but the judgments they make about them. Here that lands like a stone, because the problem is not always only what your child says, but the automatic verdict you impose on yourself when you hear it. In seconds you conclude, I have failed. I'm being unfair. I'm not being a good parent. And of course, from that place you no longer decide. You defend yourself against a guilt that may not even have come from truth, but from a skillfully planted manipulation. The adult child who uses guilt as a tool is not always a conscious villain sitting in the dark planning every move. There is no need to exaggerate the story. Sometimes they have simply learned that this language works. They learned that if they speak from responsibility, they may run into a boundary. But if they speak from the wound, from veiled reproach, or from strategic sadness, the door opens. And because it works, they repeat it. Not because they are some evil genius, but because many relationships teach the wrong lessons. They teach that guilt gets more than maturity, that drama gets more than honesty, and that emotional pressure yields better results than respect. Here a truth appears that many people struggle to accept. Feeling guilty does not mean being guilty. Sometimes it only means someone pressed an old button. A very old one. One that has spent years telling you that you must make up for things, repair, rescue, and prevent any pain in others, even if that means betraying yourself. And that is where manipulation finds fertile ground, because it does not work only with the present. It works with your history, your doubts, and your deepest cracks. That is why the way out is not to harden yourself or stop loving, but to learn to distinguish between a legitimate need and an emotional pressure tactic. Your child may be hurting and still be manipulating you. They may be suffering and still be trying to bend you to their will. Both things can coexist. Understanding that does not make you cold, it makes you clear-eyed. And clarity, though uncomfortable at first, is the first true act of respect toward yourself and also toward the relationship, because a relationship built on guilt can never be called peaceful love. Helping an adult child seems like one of the noblest things a parent can do, and in many cases it is. The problem begins when that help stops being a bridge and becomes a permanent structure where one person carries the weight and the other gets used to being carried. At that point, we are no longer talking about support, but about a dynamic that wears people down, infantilizes them, and subjugates them without the need for visible chains. And all of this brings us to the third point in this journey, when helping stops being love and starts becoming submission. There is a huge difference between offering a hand and living with your arm torn off from holding someone else up. Helping means walking alongside someone so they can regain their strength and move forward. Submitting means making yourself indispensable so the other person never has to take responsibility for themselves. But many parents cross that line without realizing it because they do it out of love, habit, or fear of seeing their child face the consequences of their own life. So they pay debts that are not theirs, solve problems they did not create, absorb tensions they did not cause, and meanwhile convince themselves that this is what being a good parent looks like, as if goodness meant draining yourself until there is nothing left. The trap is that ongoing sacrifice brings a strange sense of purpose. It makes you feel useful, necessary, even morally superior. But not everything that makes you feel needed is good for you. Sometimes it only binds you more tightly. What kind of help is it if every month it starts all over again? What kind of support is it if it does not make the other person stronger, but leaves them exactly the same or worse? When help does not encourage responsibility, but instead creates dependence, it stops healing the relationship and starts distorting it. Marcus Aurelius, who had enough power to impose his will on half the world, and yet still spoke first about self-mastery, reminded us that a good life does not consist in being dragged around by other people's impulses, but in maintaining command over oneself. And here that touches a central wound. Because the parent who lives to put out fires someone else keeps starting has lost that inner command. They no longer manage their energy, their money, their time, or their peace. Everything becomes subject to the child's next emergency, the next collapse, the next problem that of course always seems like the final one. What remarkably disciplined bad luck. The disaster always returns, but responsibility never does. And here an uncomfortable clarity is needed. There are adult children who do not just receive help, but organize their lives around the certainty that someone else will soften the consequences of their mistakes. That completely changes the relationship. They are no longer building a life with occasional support. They are building their stability on their parents' self-denial. And when that happens, the parent starts living according to the child's needs, while the child stops feeling any urgency to grow up. One becomes exhausted, the other gets comfortable, both lose. What is most painful about this submission is that it usually comes with very little gratitude and very high demands. At first there are promises, soft words, intentions to change. Then comes normalization. What used to be an extraordinary favor becomes an unspoken obligation. They no longer thank you, they complain. They no longer ask, they pressure. They no longer value what you do, they simply assume you will be there. And if one day you hesitate or set a limit, indignation appears. As if taking advantage of your devotion were an acquired right. As if you were also supposed to applaud the privilege of holding up the unbearable. Helping well does not mean doing for someone else what they already should be doing for themselves. Helping well means supporting without replacing them, standing by them without carrying their whole life on your back, loving without turning yourself into an emotional or financial servant. When you understand this, something shifts inside. You stop confusing compassion with surrender. You stop calling your own exhaustion love. And you begin to see that many times the cleanest act is not to keep rescuing, but to stop cooperating with a dynamic that is destroying both people. Manipulation becomes truly dangerous when it stops looking like an isolated problem and starts settling in as an emotional climate. It is no longer just about one argument, one demand, or one specific crisis. It is about what happens inside you before, during, and after every interaction. Your body starts to know it before your words do. Your mood gives it away before your reason does. And in this fourth part of the journey, we enter a truth many people try to minimize. The signs that reveal your peace is already being invaded. One of the first signs is anticipatory anxiety. Nothing has happened yet and you are already tense. The phone rings and your body tightens. A message comes in and your breathing changes. A family meal is coming up, and instead of feeling calm, you feel a mix of vigilance and exhaustion. That does not happen for no reason. When a relationship becomes invasive, your whole system learns to live on alert. You no longer react only to facts, you react to the possibility that conflict may erupt again. And living like that is not love, it is nervous exhaustion turned into routine. Another sign appears when saying no begins to feel almost violent. Not because it actually is, but because the relationship has trained you to associate boundaries with guilt, peace with selfishness, and distance with betrayal. So you catch yourself rehearsing extremely long explanations just to justify something as simple as not being able to, not wanting to, or not being available. And the more you justify yourself, the more you retreat inwardly. Because anyone who feels forced to defend every boundary is no longer exercising authority over their own life. They are asking permission to keep it. Epictetus spoke of something essential. No one is free if they are not master of themselves, and that does not sound distant or philosophical when you look at your daily life. If your emotional state changes depending on your child's mood, if your schedule rearranges itself every time he or she falls into crisis, if your decisions first pass through the filter of "let's see how they'll take this," then that invasion is already happening. There do not need to be dramatic insults for peace to be occupied. It is enough that you have stopped living within yourself with serenity. There is also moral exhaustion, which may be one of the quietest signs of all. You are not just physically tired. You are tired of explaining, of holding things together, of waiting for changes that never come, of trying not to hurt while being hurt, of choosing your words as if you were diffusing explosives in a locked room. And the cruelest part is that sometimes you do not even allow yourself to acknowledge that exhaustion because the same old voice immediately appears. It's your child, hold on a little longer. Of course, hold on a little longer, then a little longer after that, and then your whole life, since your peace seems to be everyone's favorite natural resource. There is another sign many people overlook because they consider it normal. Stopping yourself from enjoying your own life for no clear reason. You begin to feel guilty when you are doing well, when you rest, when you make plans, when you are not available to solve someone else's problem. Joy starts to feel suspicious. Peace feels like an undeserved luxury. And so the relationship no longer invades only your difficult moments, it also contaminates your good ones. That is not just ordinary family tension. That is emotional colonization. Marcus Aurelius wrote to remind himself that the mind can keep its strength if it does not surrender its judgment to external disorder. But that strength does not appear on its own. It has to be protected. And protecting it begins with recognizing the signs without dressing them up. If you live in fear of the next reaction, if your body tenses before every contact, if you feel exhausted, guilty, and mentally besieged, then you are no longer facing a vague suspicion. You are already inside a dynamic that is invading your peace. Seeing it may hurt, yes, but continuing to deny it costs far more. At this point, many people have already recognized the signs, already feel the exhaustion, already know that something in the relationship is twisted. And yet they still keep explaining everything away, softening everything, forgiving everything. Not because they do not see what is happening, but because accepting the truth shatters an emotional image they have protected for years. That is why this fifth part is so delicate. It is not enough to detect manipulation. You also have to dismantle the mistake of continuing to justify the unjustifiable. One of the most common forms of self-deception is turning every harmful behavior into an understandable exception. They're going through a hard time. They have a lot of wounds. They don't know how to handle themselves. Deep down, they didn't mean to hurt me. And of course, once may be true, twice maybe. But when the pattern repeats for years, you are no longer looking at an exception. You are looking at a structure. What makes it so hard is that recognizing it forces you to admit something painful. Love has not been enough to correct the dynamic, and your endless understanding has not made it healthier, only more tolerated. Here, a very human resistance comes in. Many parents would rather feel exhausted than disappointed. They would rather carry the damage than accept that the child they love has learned to invade, pressure, or emotionally use the relationship. Because accepting that feels almost like betraying their own life story. It means admitting that something went wrong, that something became distorted, that tenderness did not always create reciprocity. And so the automatic defense appears. justify, reinterpret, minimize. Anything before looking the real wound straight in the face. Seneca observed something that fits here with precision. A person who does not want to face the truth ends up manufacturing comforts that make them weaker. And that is what happens every time you cover up the obvious, so you do not have to suffer the blow of recognizing it. Every justification gives you relief for a moment, but at the same time it prolongs the problem. Because while you keep translating aggression as fragility and abuse as emotional difficulty, the other person keeps operating without restraint. The fog calms you for a while, yes, but it also leaves you exposed. There is an inner scene that repeats itself often. You know something was wrong. You felt it in your body, in the knot in your stomach, in the exhaustion it left behind afterward. But right away that voice appears, pushing you to reinterpret everything so you do not have to face the truth. It wasn't that bad. I reacted badly too. Maybe I misunderstood it. Funny how clarity always ends up negotiating with itself when reality hurts. And meanwhile, the boundary you were going to set dissolves again. The conversation you were going to have gets postponed once more, and the invasion keeps advancing in total comfort. Justifying the unjustifiable also has a silent consequence. It trains you to betray yourself. Not all at once, but in small doses. One time you stay quiet about something that hurt you. Another time you accept a tone that humiliated you. Later you offer help again, even though you already know it will be used irresponsibly. And so, almost without noticing, you become the main accomplice in your own exhaustion. This is not being said to blame you, but to wake you up. Because as long as you keep interpreting clarity as harshness, you will remain trapped in a misunderstood form of compassion. Accepting the truth does not force you to stop loving your child. It forces you to stop lying to yourself about the relationship, and that difference changes everything. Love does not require denying what hurts. Love does not require justifying disrespect or tolerating dynamics that erode you. On the contrary, only when you look clearly at what is happening can you begin to act cleanly. As long as you keep decorating the unacceptable, the problem will only keep deepening. Peace does not return where truth continues to be pushed out by habit. After recognizing manipulation, identifying its signs and dismantling the excuses, the most frightening point arrives: how to protect yourself without turning into someone hardened, distant, or cruel. Because many parents believe there are only two options: keep giving in or enter an exhausting battle. But no, there is a third path, more sober, more grounded, and much harder. Protecting your peace without falling into either coldness or war. Protecting your peace does not mean punishing your child, humiliating them, or returning the harm. It means reclaiming control of your inner space and your concrete decisions. It means stopping the automatic response to every crisis, stepping out of the emotional theater of every emergency, and beginning to act from clear judgment. It is not about speaking louder, it is about standing firmer. Because real firmness does not need a spectacle. Sometimes a brief sentence, a guilt-free no, or a well-held distance is enough to dismantle years of manipulation. And of course, that usually unsettles the other person because the system stops working the way it used to. This is where many people fail, not out of malice, but out of anxiety. They set a boundary, see their child's reaction, and immediately back down to avoid conflict. And then the message becomes clear. The boundary was negotiable. The pressure works. It just takes a little more insistence. That is why protecting yourself requires consistency, not one-day acts of heroism. It requires tolerating the initial discomfort without rushing to make it disappear. Will there be anger? Probably. Will there be reproaches? Almost certainly. Will there be attempts to make you feel cruel? Yes, that too. But the fact that the other person is uncomfortable does not mean you are doing something wrong. Sometimes it only means you are no longer available to be used in the same way. Musonius Rufus, a lesser quoted but deeply practical Stoic teacher, insisted that the good life did not depend on brilliant speeches, but on upright habits. And here that is pure gold. Because peace is not protected by one big emotional conversation, but by steady actions. Not solving what is not your responsibility, not financing irresponsibility, not stepping into circular arguments, not justifying every decision, not rescuing out of fear of other people's judgment. It is less dramatic than many would like and much more effective. Peace is protected by structure, not by promises. Something else important also has to be examined. Setting boundaries is not declaring a power war. When you step in to fight over who is in control, you have already fallen into the game. The manipulator knows that ground very well. They live off reaction. That is why the way out is not to shout more, accuse more, or lecture more. The way out is to leave the dance. Do not argue over every provocation. Do not answer every insinuation. Do not renegotiate what you already decided calmly. There is enormous dignity in that restraint. And yes, from the outside it may look like coldness to someone who is used to your total availability. But it is not. It is self-respect. Protecting your peace also means accepting that you cannot control how your change will be interpreted. If you were accommodating for years, your firmness may be read as distance. If you spent years rescuing, your withdrawal may be read as abandonment. If you carried the drama for years, your silence may seem like indifference. But you cannot keep organizing your life around self-serving interpretations. You cannot live begging for the other person to understand before finally giving yourself permission to protect yourself. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the soul takes on the color of its thoughts, and that is why protecting yourself does not only mean changing outward behavior, but also changing the inner story through which you relate to yourself. Stop telling yourself that you are a bad person for setting a boundary. Stop thinking that love requires infinite availability. Stop believing that protecting your peace is selfish. Your peace deserves defense, not apologies. And when you finally act from that place without unnecessary harshness but without surrendering again, something begins to fall back into order. The relationship may become uncomfortable. It may even grow more tense for a while. But inside you, something begins to be born that had been pushed aside for far too long: inner authority. There is a deeply rooted idea in many parents that loving a child means always being there, always supporting, always rescuing. As if real love were measured by how much weight a person can carry without breaking. But that idea, when left unexamined, can destroy everything. Because there comes a point when continuing to save the other person does not protect them, it weakens them. It does not bring them closer to their truth, it pulls them away from it. It does not help them grow, it gets them used to living off someone else's sacrifice. And that is why this final part demands a maturity not everyone is willing to embrace. Saving is not always loving. Sometimes what looks like compassion is really fear. Fear of letting go, fear of being judged, fear of feeling like you are abandoning someone. So the parent keeps softening consequences, covering mistakes, repairing ruins they did not build. And they do it with the secret hope that this time finally the child will react, learn, appreciate it. But many times that does not happen. Because while you keep shielding them from the impact of their decisions, he or she keeps living far from responsibility. And a life without responsibility never truly matures. It may grow older, it may make demands, it may play the victim, but it does not mature. This is where the conscience rebels. Because stepping away from an unhealthy dynamic feels almost unnatural when you have spent years associating love with rescue. How can you not help? How can you not step in? How can you stand still when you know the other person may fall? But there is a question many people avoid because it dismantles the whole illusion. Are you really helping them? Or are you just avoiding your own pain at seeing them face what belongs to them? That question is uncomfortable because it forces you to distinguish between the other person's good and your own need to keep feeling needed. Epictetus taught that each person must carry what belongs to them and not what they imagine they could control in the lives of others. And although he spoke from an ancient philosophy, here he touches something brutally current. Rescuing without limits does not always come from wisdom. Sometimes it comes from an inability to tolerate another person's freedom, even when that freedom includes making mistakes. Loving someone also means allowing reality to teach them what you can no longer teach with words, money, or sacrifice. Not rescuing does not mean wishing your child harm. It does not mean taking pleasure in their fall or washing your hands of them. It means no longer standing between them and the consequences they need to go through in order to wake up. It means understanding that some lessons only arrive when no one else keeps cushioning the blow. And yes, that hurts. It hurts deeply. Because it destroys the fantasy that your endless giving was going to fix what the other person never wanted to face. But continuing to feed that fantasy costs even more. It consumes you and at the same time prolongs in them a warped way of living. Marcus Aurelius reminded us that we should not act to please the impulse of the moment, but in accordance with what is right. And here what is right does not always match what feels emotionally easiest. What feels easiest may be to give in again, solve things again, carry the burden again just to calm the immediate anguish. What is right, on the other hand, sometimes requires you to step back with dignity, hold the line, and endure being misunderstood for a while. What a bitter irony. Many parents feel like monsters for no longer rescuing. If you have made it this far, when in reality they were being devoured by a dynamic, you can no longer afford to keep confusing love with submission. The final surrender is this, and guilt with responsibility. Loving well does not always mean moving closer. You have already seen that manipulation by an stepping away does not always arrive with visible violence. It does not always mean giving more. Many times it settles in. Sometimes it means stopping the giving that is feeding the distortion of the relationship. Until one day you realize you have given away too much. It does not always mean saving, because there are rescues that humiliate more of you while giving less and less balance in return, and empty the one doing the rescue. That realization, painful when you finally understand that, can also be the beginning of your noble chain and become something cleaner. Because protecting your peace does not make you a bad father. An act of awareness that no longer sacrifices. It returns you to the place from which love can exist without degrading you. Stoicism has said it in many ways over the centuries. You cannot govern another person's life, but you can govern your mind, your decisions, and the limits of what you allow. And sometimes that limit is the only thing that keeps the relationship from rotting all the way through on the inside. Not to punish, not to get revenge, but to stop cooperating with a dynamic that wounds everyone. Perhaps the bravest thing you can do now is not to keep enduring in silence, but to begin seeing everything with a clarity that no longer negotiates with guilt. To accept that not every rescue saves. To accept that not every closeness heals. To accept that love also requires firmness, distance, and at certain moments the decision to stop carrying what only stays standing because of your own exhaustion. That is a hard truth for emotional pride, but a deeply liberating one for the soul. If this message helped you see things more clearly, write in the comments, "I reclaim my power, I want to hear from you." And if this video put into words something you have been living in silence for far too long, subscribe to the Stoic Garden, because here we are not here to decorate wounds. We are here to strengthen the soul, as the ancient Stoics did. See you in the next video.